Welcome to a new Team CGC 9.8 video, and today's video is on Transformers comics. And more specifically, I want to get into the 1980s to early 90s run of Transformers comics because I think this entire run, there's a lot of really good investment grade books that you could buy throughout that run. And obviously I brought out the two key issues I have from that run. I have a Transformers 1 in the first print and a CBCS 9.8. And Transformers number 80, the last issue of the run in the CGC 9.8. And yeah, this Transformers run's kind of got a little bit of everything. Near the end, in the early 90s, you got some of these low print run issues, which for the early 90s is really rare. Usually in the 90s, all these comics were really well printed in the early 90s. So to have some early 90s issues with quite limited numbers is really awesome, I think. So there's that. And then you get some really cool first appearances throughout the run as well. And obviously I got number 1, the first Autobots and Decepticons, Optimus Prime and Megatron, so you get all the big first appearances in there. But we'll go over each issue, the price, and how rare they are on the CGC census, and then I want to go over some other keys as well that I think are really good investment grade books that you could buy too throughout the Transformers range. But really quick before we do that, just invite you to join the team here and subscribe to Team CGC 9.8 and hit that bell. Make sure you get all the notifications. We're doing about 4 or 5 videos a week now, so yeah, super appreciative if you did subscribe to the channel. But let's get right into the books here. Well, Transformers number 1, you got to go over that first. This is a book that I unboxed probably about a month ago now. And I was really happy to grab this book. I bought it from an auction in the United States from a seller that had really good shipping, I would say too. It was only a little bit less than 20 bucks American to ship to Canada, which usually that's not the case. Usually it's quite really expensive from a lot of other sellers. So I kind of just jumped on this one. Looked great in the pictures, looks great in real life. Really bright colors, vivid colors, and sometimes. I kind of mentioned this in my other video. For Transformers number 1s, you don't see very many of them, but when you do see them, a lot of times the colors are a little bit faded. It's quite off-centered. So when I saw this one, really nicely centered issue with really bright colors. And this is one that was on my sort of main watch list. I wanted a Transformers number 1. So this issue has the first Autobots and first Decepticons. So you're going to get all the first appearances of all the key Transformers in there. So, Optimus Prime and Megatron. Let's take a look on the CGC census. Now, obviously this is a CBCS 9.8. So, to my knowledge, I don't believe CBCS has a public census yet. So, I was doing some Google searches trying to find it. I couldn't find it. So, we'll look on the CGC census. You get kind of a rough idea of how many of these are out there kind of thing. So Transformers number 1, there are 413 CGC 9.8 Transformers number 1s in the first print. So 413, that's not very much for an iconic first appearance in Origin from this is a 1984 book, so mid-80s. That's not very much. 413, usually with an iconic first appearance, you're pushing 1,000 in most issues, and a lot of times over 1,000. Like an Amazing Spider-Man 300 has almost 1,000 CGC 9.8s, even though it's really rare. Almost 1,000 still. There's like 950 of them about. So this issue, for again a really iconic first appearance in Origin, there's not very many of them. And I hunted for this issue too for probably about over 6 months. So from experience, I can attest that there's not very many of them, and if the ones that they are, the collectors seem to be holding on to them more so than wanting to just sell them and get some cash in return. It looks like collectors and comic book investors are holding this issue. So there's 413, pretty limited numbers for an iconic first appearance. 18.4% of all graded books are 9.8s on the CGC census. And that's a pretty good ratio. Anything under 20 is pretty rare. Under 10 is really rare. The lower the better for these CGC 9.8 ratios. 18.4%, pretty rare, not super rare. And that's kind of reflected in this book. I feel like if this book was under 10% CGC 9.8 ratio, it would definitely be over $1,000 in the, you know, the CBCS or CGC 9.8. So, you know, because you get all those great iconic first appearances, there's only 413 in the world, which is not a lot for a really iconic first appearance. I think this is a really, really good investment grade issue. And so, you know, looking at price, how much did I purchase this for? It was about $440. Ended up being like $437-ish. So we'll call it $440 US for this book. And the thing about this book, though, you see a lot of these buy it nows for like $700–800, some of them, in a first print Transformers #1, which this one is. This one is a first print. Yeah, you see some really elevated buy it now prices for this book, and you know, you don't see very many of them. And what that tells me is, you know, collectors that are holding it kind of think it's worth a lot more. And in general, I really get that feeling as well, because, you know, such an iconic first appearance. There's a huge promotional machine and movie machine for Transformers as well. And again, there's only 413 of them, which is not a lot for a first appearance. So I think if any sort of pop culture event or something happens to kind of boost up Transformers in any way, there's limited numbers of the Transformers one, so I could see this book going for a lot more than I paid for it in that kind of environment. And I'm really confident sort of just long-term holding it, that, you know, over the long term it'll probably slowly gain in value as well. So, you know, I was lucky enough to pick one up in the CBCS 9.8, and, you know, a lot of, you know, with, just quickly, I'll kind of go over CBCS, CGC right now. For me, I pretty much would recommend to buy the book. So, you know, look at the book in the pictures. Does it have really nice colors? Is it centered nicely? You know, if one's a CBCS 9.8, if another one's the CGC 9.8, just look really closely at the pictures. And, you know, I always prefer to buy the ones with more vivid colors and centered nicely. So, and a lot of, you know, CGC 9.8s, they're all not centered really nicely, and they all don't have vivid colors. You know, a lot of those are kind of printing defects, essentially. So yeah, what I would recommend with CBCS and CGC books is just buy the book. They're essentially, to me, they're almost the same. In general, I would say the equivalent CGC book maybe goes for about 10 or 20% more as far as price, but I could see that closing over time, because, you know, CBCS, one thing not everyone might know is they're owned by Beckett. So Beckett is the #1 grading company in sports cards. So obviously, you know, very well trusted within the collector community. So I think there's no reason to sort of, you know, think that CBCS books are lower quality than CGC books, you know, if they're both the equivalent grade. So yeah, my recommendation would be to buy the book, not the grading company. And, you know, that's what I do. I only have one CBCS book, so, you know, I'm sort of into the, you know, into the zone of kind of searching for CGC 9.8s. So every now and then I'll do a search for CBCS 9.8s, but I think I'm just more on top of the CGC market because I'm more used to it. But over time, I could totally see myself, you know, buying more CBCS comics if they're the same book for less price. I would totally see myself, you know, buying more CBCS books in the future. So Transformers 1, I honestly, you know, I can't recommend it enough, pretty much. I think you're getting all those really good first appearances and origins, and, you know, it's quite a rare book, again, for a really iconic first appearance. It's only 413 of them. That's a pretty rare book. And yeah, I paid $440 for the CBCS. It was on an auction, waited for an auction. You know, those fixed price auctions are getting like to $600–700, so, you know, you might want to be patient with a Transformers 1 and wait for an auction. So next issue, Transformers number 80. This is the last issue of the whole kind of Transformers run. And what's kind of cool, actually, is it, like you see here, it's like number 80 in a 4-issue limited series. And then this one says number 1 in a 4-issue limited series. So I thought it was kind of cool that they just kept the 4-issue limited series even though this is number 8. Kind of one of those weird quirks. And this book, Transformers number 80, as well as some of the later Transformers books, they're all low print books. And I'm not too sure what happened, but apparently they just kind of rushed out the prints for the end because they weren't selling very well, or I'm not too sure exactly what happened, but and that over time has kind of become a benefit, because early 90s books, there's so many of them. This is when comic book printing and sport card collecting just sort of had that peak bubble blow off top, I would say. But because of this low print run of Transformers that happened back in the day, for reasons that I don't really know, there are only 59 of these on the CGC census. So Transformers number 80, only 59 CGC 9.8s in the Transformers number 80. So it's a really hard book to find in a really high grade. It was low printed in the 90s, and there are not a lot of low printed books from the 90s. So pretty much for that reason alone, I would say, you know, Transformers number 80 is a really good key issue to get from this whole run. Another reason too is from the Overstreet price guides that I have. Transformers number 80 is the second highest issue that's worth the most. It's the second highest dollar amount issue out of the whole Transformers run, the first being Transformers 1. So, you know, Transformers 1's worth over $100, I think it is in a good grade, and this one's worth like, I believe it's like 80 or like 75 or 80. And then, you know, we'll get into some of the other key issues, but basically these are the two, you know, highest priced key issues in the Overstreet price guide. And luckily, you know, for this issue number 80, when you look on the CGC census, there's only 59 of them in the CGC 9.8, so you get a 1 of 59 item. And the CGC ratio is quite positive too, at 15.7%. So 15.7% of all of these graded books were 9.8s. And that's lower than Transformers 1, which is kind of interesting. And that's quite low for a 90s book. Usually in the 90s, those ratios are 25, 30, even more. So yeah, a lot of, you know, when you look on the CGC census for this book, even though it doesn't really have too much of an, you know, an iconic first appearance or anything, it's a low printed book. There's only 59 in the CGC 9.8. It's got a low 9.8 ratio. So, you know, if you are buying Transformers books, this would be sort of the second issue I would recommend to get. The first one being issue number 1, second being issue number 80, the last issue of that series, which came out in 1991. And for this book, I paid about $270 for this book, and it was a buy it now. Like, it wasn't even, this is one of the original, probably one of the first 10 CGC books I ever bought was this Transformers 80. You know, doing some research on it, I remember on eBay there was like 20 people watching it, so it was highly watched. And I think if it was in a new case, it would have for sure got bought a lot before I, you know, saw it and wanted to grab it. But, you know, I think if, you know, in an old case for $270, I think that's a pretty fair price. I think if you saw one of these pop up in an auction in an old case, it might go for maybe between $200 and $250. So maybe I paid up a little bit for that one. But in a new case, I could see that going for, you know, $270, $280. That's where a lot of, like, sort of Spider-Man key, sort of secondary Spider-Man key issues go for, like, you know, $270, $280, $260. Like Amazing Spider-Man 316, Amazing Spider-Man 298. All those kind of go in that area. So I could see that book in that area, in that price range, essentially. All right. Let's go over some of the other Transformers books from that era that I think are really collectible, really cool investment grade books. So Transformers number 8 is the first full Dinobots, and it's got a really cool cover, really collectible cover. That's one that I've seen some auctions in Canada come up, and you know, usually that issue will kind of go from like $150 to $200 in that price range. Maybe a little over $200 depending, you know, if you get a pretty popular auction, but still really affordable for, you know, Transformers number 8, first full appearance of the Dinobots. Really cool cover. That would be maybe one I'd recommend if you're on a bit of a budget. Transformers number 10 is Introduction to the Constructicons, and that one's kind of elevated in price compared to some of the other issues in the Overstreet price guide. So Transformers number 10 is also another key. Number 16, Transformers number 16 is Bumblebee's Last Stance. So it's got Bumblebee on the cover, and that actually would be a pretty cool one to get. I think Bumblebee in this first run of, you know, these 1980s, 1990s Transformers comics wasn't such a main one of the Transformers, whereas now that movie came out and seems to have quite a bigger following nowadays. So Transformers number 16 is one you could certainly look at too. I also like it's Transformers number 53 and number 67 are Jim Lee covers. Early Jim Lee covers. They look really cool too. I just googled them because I saw them in the price guide, but I hadn't seen them in real life. Google them. They're really cool covers. So number 53 and number 67 are Jim Lee covers. Those are something I'm kind of maybe adding these on kind of a secondary want list. Maybe I'll pick up some raw copies of these if I see them at good prices. And last couple issues here are the low print issues from the end of the series. So 75, 78, 79, and 80 are like low print issues in the price guide, in the Overstreet price guide I have. Really cool covers too. If you look on these, really cool covers for all these issues. This kind of has that early 90s, vivid colors, which I really like. And yeah, it's number 75, 78, 79, and then 80. And yeah, these, usually in the CGC 9.8, every now and then you'll see these end of the series low print run issues kind of pop up for like pretty expensive buy it nows. So I'm thinking like $300 to $400 US in a buy it now. And I think it's just because they're so low print and there's not very many of them that, because there's not very many of them, if you are looking for it and one pops up at a kind of elevated buy it now, it's more likely to sell. But if we're really patient on these, you're probably looking at anywhere from $200 to $250 for these low print and end of the series low print issues, because there's no real like first appearance or anything. They're just limited numbers and low print, so big Transformers collectors really want those kind of issues. Okay, I think that's about it for Transformers. We got some of these secondary issues that I think are really cool buys. Probably out of the secondary issues, number 8, First Full Dinobots, is probably the coolest cover and the easiest to find. Whereas, probably those ending low print runs would be more of a, if you were just kind of a collector and, coming at it from an investment perspective, you want those limited numbers and everything like that, those low print. Final issues, 75, 78, 79, and 80, obviously, in the low print, I think are really good issues too. Okay, but yeah, Transformers, especially Transformers number 1, obviously we went over all the key issues, but if you just had to buy one, I think, first appearance and origin of the Autobots and the Decepticons, I think is going to do really good over time. Transformers, I think, people that are into it from the 80s, it's so nostalgic to them, and if you look at any of these original Transformers toys that are in the box, they're just so expensive, thousands and thousands of dollars for Transformers in the box toys. And, you read, or if you ever talk to people that really like Transformers and when they were a kid, there is a big nostalgic connection to Transformers. So, and obviously this whole, in the last, 10 years, there's been 6 or 7 Transformers movies as well. So that promotional machine's getting into the younger generation too. So I just think over the long term, Transformers number 1 is going to be a really good issue to have. If you're thinking about it from an investment perspective, I totally recommend the CGC 9.8 or the CBCS 9.8. Only 413 of them. That's a really limited number for a first appearance and origin. And if not, if you're not thinking of it from an investment perspective, maybe just a really nice raw issue in the best grade you could afford of a Transformers number 1. And yeah, if you wanted to get really into it, again, those low print near the end issues, or number 8, First Full Dinobots, number 10, Intro to Constructicons, number 16 is Bumblebee's Last Stance, and number 53 and number 67 are cool Jim Lee covers. Those would be my picks from the whole series. Okay, well, thanks so much for watching the video today, and if you haven't already, please join the team and subscribe to Team CGC 9.8 here. Yeah, I would really appreciate it if you subscribe to the channel, and yeah, appreciate all the support, all the comments that I'm getting from everyone. Really helps me out, just staying motivated, and I am really motivated to keep going with this channel. And yeah, so happy I have these now too, because when I originally purchased Transformers, I've always been a Transformers fan, but I originally purchased number 80 at first. Mostly just because it was really limited on the CGC census, and it seemed like kind of a good limited investment grade type buy at the time when I was first starting out. And then yeah, a month ago to just add Transformers #1, which I think is pretty much a grail basically at this point. And if it's not now, I think give it 10-20 years, I think it's going to do really well over the long term. Okay, thank you very much for watching today. I really appreciate all the support from everyone. Thank you so much, and I'll see you on the next video.